On a chaotic day, with no one to pick up his disabled son from school, the millionaire himself had to leave work in a hurry. But upon entering the gates, he freezes at the scene, his humble nanny, alone, facing bullies to protect the boy. Seconds later, the millionaire takes such a surprising action that makes the nanny's heart race instantly. The smell of disinfectant and freshly baked chocolate chip cookies from the cafeteria mingled in the hallways of Northwood Preparatory Academy, an aroma that, for Elena, signified the end of another day's battle. Leaning against the cold tile wall, she adjusted the strap of her simple, tea-worn handbag, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of teenagers dispersing noisily. Her daughter, Sophia, was already waiting for her near the gate, engrossed in a book with a frayed cover. But Elena had one last duty. It was her obligation to wait for Leo, her employer's son, a 12-year-old boy who had navigated the world on crutches since a soccer accident. The responsibility weighed on her shoulders as much as the electric bill waiting for her at home. She wasn't paid for this, but the boy was sweet, and his father, Arthur, a man whose legendary fortune kept him perpetually absent, seemed to value these small gestures of care. Leo appeared at the end of the hall, his heavy backpack unbalancing his movements. He moved with a painful concentration, each step a calculated effort. Behind him, a trio of older boys followed, their muffled laughter laced with a subtle poison. Elena felt the air grow heavy. The group's leader, a broad-shouldered boy with a sneering smile, quickened his pace and, as he passed Leo, purposefully stumbled, mimicking the boy's limp. "Whoa! Almost fell there," he guffawed, and his friends echoed the mockery. "Careful you don't break the other leg, Gimpy." Leo hunched his shoulders, his face flushing with a humiliation that was visibly old. He lowered his head, wishing only to disappear. Elena's blood boiled. She, who had grown up hearing that people like her were meant to stay quiet, felt an ancestral strength rise up her spine. She took 2 steps forward, planting herself like a barrier between Leo and his tormentors. Her hands trembled, but her voice came out firm, cutting through the corridor's noise. "Excuse me, could you please give him some space to pass?" she asked, the polite tone concealing a protective fury. The tallest boy looked her up and down. "Who are you, the help? Does he need a nanny to walk?" The laughter intensified. "Can't run, champ," another whispered cruelly. Elena didn't back down. She placed a protective hand on Leo's shoulder, feeling the boy's body tremble. "I'm only going to ask one more time, and after that, I'm calling a responsible adult." That was when a silent shadow fell beside them. Arthur, the multi-millionaire owner of an incalculable fortune in stocks and investments, had arrived. He stood still, the knot of his tie perfectly aligned, his Italian leather shoes gleaming. He hadn't come to pick up his son. He had a meeting in the area and had decided to surprise him. And now, he was observing the scene with a chilling stillness. He had never known about the bullying. Leo, out of shame, had always kept silent. Arthur walked slowly toward the group, his eyes fixed not on the teenagers, but on Eleanor. In her face, he saw the trembling dignity, the fear and courage fighting a silent battle. Without a word, he removed his designer jacket, a piece worth more than her monthly salary, and placed it over Elena's shoulders. The gesture was so unexpected that everyone fell silent. The dean, Ms. Albright, arrived at that moment, hurried and out of breath. "Mr. Crestwood, is there a problem?" Arthur faced her, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the hallway. "She came to pick up her daughter and protected mine. From now on, no one is left alone here." The weight of the jacket on Elena's shoulders was warm, an unlikely shield that made her feel seen for the first time in years. Her heart pounded, not from the luxurious fabric, but from the public acknowledgement that pulled her from invisibility, leaving her exposed and trembling under the gaze of a man who had just changed all the rules of her world. Arthur's jacket still weighed on Elena's shoulders as the hallways finally emptied, leaving a tense silence in the air. Ms. Albright, the dean stammered apologies, dispersed the teenagers with a severe glare, and promised immediate action. Arthur, however, was not a man who settled for vague promises. His mind, accustomed to analyzing the cash flow of large corporations and predicting stock market movements, was already mapping out a strategy. He thanked Elena with a nod, a contained gesture that carried an ocean of gratitude, and scheduled a meeting with the school board for the following morning, his voice leaving no room for refusal. Eleanor, feeling the expensive fabric under her fingers, just nodded, her heart still racing. That jacket was more than a piece of clothing. It was armor he had lent her, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. The next morning, the headmaster's office felt like a minefield. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat Arthur, as impassive as an investor about to close a multi-million-dollar deal. Beside him, looking slightly out of place in her simplicity, was Elena. On the other side, Ms. Albright and the school counselor tried to smooth things over. "Mr. Crestwood, we understand your concern, but it was just some teenage teasing," the dean began, her voice syrupy. "Boys will be boys. Sometimes they don't think before they speak." Elena felt her blood run cold. They were minimizing Leo's pain, turning cruelty into a game. She glanced at Arthur, who met her gaze with a look that said, "Wait." But Elena couldn't wait. She, who had always faded into the background to avoid conflict, felt that silence would be a betrayal. With Arthur's silent permission, she opened her handbag and took out a sketchbook. It was Leo's. She placed it on the table and opened it to a specific page. The drawing, made with harsh, dark strokes, depicted a long hallway whose walls transformed into giant, gaping mouths, ready to swallow a small figure on crutches. The room fell silent. "This is not teenage teasing," Elena said, her voice low but resonating with the force of truth. "This is fear." Before the dean could recover, Elena picked up her daughter Sophia's phone. "My daughter recorded this the other day, without my knowing." She pressed play. A teenager's clear, cruel voice echoed in the room. "Dead weight, a liability to the team." The words were undeniable, the malice explicit. The evidence turned the tables. The dean, visibly shaken, could no longer hide behind euphemisms. Arthur then spoke, his tone as cold as steel. "The question is no longer if we will act, but how. And I will be here to ensure that the action is effective." He looked at Elena, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the controlling millionaire. She saw a desperate father, willing to use all his fortune and power to protect his son. And she, the humble caregiver, was now his most crucial ally in this unexpected war. The audio proof was a masterstroke. The dean paled, the counselor cleared his throat loudly, and the school's resistance crumbled like a sandcastle. They agreed, with a newfound urgency, to organize restorative justice circles. Arthur, with the cold precision of someone negotiating high-risk assets, pressed for a date. Ms. Albright, however, was already recovering, a master in the art of bureaucratic delay. Of course, an excellent initiative, but we're on the eve of our annual cultural fair, an event that involves the entire community. It would be more productive to schedule it for the following week, don't you think? That way we'll have more time to plan. Arthur recognized the tactic. It was the same as a partner telling him the balance sheet would be presented after the internal audit. A polite way of kicking the can down the road, hoping the capital of his outrage would deplete. He said nothing, but his eyes registered the maneuver. That night, the silence in Arthur's glass-walled house in the wealthy suburbs north of the city was deafening. His business success had never prepared him for the emotional bankruptcy he felt looking at his son's room. He wanted to thank Elena, to do something that measured up to what she had done. He picked up the phone and, with a hesitation he rarely showed, invited her and Sophia to dinner at his house that weekend. "Just to thank you for everything," he said, his voice sounding overly formal. On the other end of the line, Elena felt a cold panic. Dinner at his house. The invitation, however kind, dangerously blurred the lines that kept her safe. She was the caregiver, the invisible employee. Accepting would mean entering unknown territory, where the rules were unclear and her already tumultuous heart could get confused. "Thank you so much, Mr. Crestwood, really, but I already have plans," she lied, the flimsy excuse hanging in the air. Arthur hung up, not angry, but strangely introspective. He understood. The chasm between their worlds was too vast to be crossed with a simple dinner invitation. He needed a different approach, less direct, more subtle. He remembered Sophia, the girl with intelligent eyes who always carried a book. The next day, a courier left a box at Elena's door. Inside, with no return address, was a collection of American literary classics, the same one Sophia had mentioned in passing that she needed for school, and a new tablet. Elena knew immediately. That gesture, anonymous and precise, touched her more deeply than any luxurious dinner ever could. It wasn't charity, it was attention. It was a man who knew how to listen. When Arthur called again a few days later, his tone was different. There was no formality, just a raw urgency. "Eleanor, the school is stalling, and I've realized I don't know how to fight this battle. I know how to build a fortune, how to analyze the stock market, but I don't know how to fix this for my son." He paused, and the sound of his breath was that of a man stripped of his armor. "I need to learn how to be a present father. Teach me what you know about courage." His honest confession disarmed her. He wasn't offering money or power, he was asking for help as an equal. Before she could form a response, a notification flashed on her phone screen. It was a message from a school parents group chat, forwarded multiple times. The long text was signed by a Victoria Vance, the mother of the lead tormentor. In it, she accused a certain employee of staging a drama to advance herself at the expense of a childish prank, insinuating that she was eyeing the millionaire father's fortune. The war had just been declared in a public forum. The message on Elena's phone burned like a hot coal. Every word from Victoria Vance was a calculated attack, painting her as a social climber, an opportunist using a child's fragility to get closer to Arthur's wealth. The poison of the insinuation was more painful than a direct insult. Elena's first reaction was her usual one: retreat, quit, disappear, protect herself and Sophia from public humiliation. What could she, a woman who counted coins for groceries, do against the wife of an influential lawyer, a prominent figure in the town's social circles? Sophia, noticing her mother's pale face, took the phone from her hand. She read the message, her eyes darkening with a cold, lucid anger that Elena hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "You are not quitting, Mom. Not now." Across the city, in the headquarters of his financial empire, Arthur read the same words on his own phone, forwarded by a contact. His initial reaction was purely strategic, a public relations problem. He immediately thought of lawyers, official statements, ways to neutralize the threat to his image and, by extension, his business. The stability of his capital depended on a pristine reputation. He called Richard, his business partner, a man whose loyalty was devoted exclusively to the bottom line. Richard's response was brutal and pragmatic. "Arthur, this is a liability. Get rid of this woman. Hire the best mediators. Pay whatever it takes, but remove her from the equation. We can't have personal drama spilling over onto our net worth. Our investors don't like noise." Richard's suggestion, so logical from a business standpoint, repulsed Arthur. Pushing Elena away would be the same as siding with Victoria. It would be abandoning the one person who had shown him the truth. It would be an act of cowardice. For the first time, his partner's advice sounded hollow, devoid of real value. He hung up and, without hesitating, called Eleanor. "I saw the message," he said, his voice firm. "Don't respond. Don't do anything. We're in this together." The simplicity of those words, "We're in this together," was an anchor for Eleanor. She took a deep breath, her daughter's determination echoing in her employer's promise. The bond between them grew in small gestures, woven into the routines that began to form. Leo's physical therapy afternoons became a commitment for all four of them. While the boy struggled with his exercises, Sophia would sit beside him and read aloud, transporting him to fantasy worlds where legs didn't matter. Arthur and Elena watched from a distance, a silent complicity growing between them. On one of those afternoons, to break the tension that hung in the air, Arthur had an impulse. "Let's go to the city's historic market. I've never taken Leo there." The idea was so outside his universe of expensive restaurants and controlled environments that it surprised everyone. At the market, the smell of aged cheese and spices mixed with the din of conversations. Leo, initially shy, was swept up by the vibrant energy. A hot dog vendor, with a wide grin, handed him a classic Chicago-style dog and called him Captain. The smile that spread across Leo's face was so genuine that Arthur felt a tightness in his chest. It was a smile that all his money, all his dollars and euros couldn't buy. He looked at Elena, who was sipping her freshly squeezed lemonade with the natural ease of someone who belonged there, and understood that true wealth was right here, in this noisy human simplicity. The peace of that moment, however, was fragile. As they were leaving, Arthur's phone buzzed with a new message, this time from Richard. The text was short and alarming. "Victoria Vance is on the board of one of our main investment funds. She just demanded an emergency meeting." Richard's threat hung over Arthur like a storm cloud. Victoria Vance wasn't just a bully's mother. She was a strategic player on his complex financial chessboard, capable of influencing other investors and shaking confidence in his business. The logic of capital demanded that he retreat, sacrifice the personal cause for the sake of economic stability. Any other man in his position would have cut ties with Elena immediately, offered her a non-disclosure agreement, and closed the matter. But something inside him had changed. The image of Leo's smile at the market, a smile he himself rarely saw, was worth more than any dividend. He replied to Richard with calculated coldness, "Schedule the meeting, I'll be there." While Arthur prepared for the corporate battle, a quieter war was being waged in the school hallways. Ms. Albright, pressured by Victoria's influence, took a subtle but vicious action. She approached Sophia during a break, her voice coated in a false layer of concern. "Dear, I know you and Leo have become good friends, but to avoid any more trouble, perhaps it would be best if you didn't hang around the high school wing for a while, okay? It's just to protect you." The message was clear. The caregiver's daughter did not belong in that space. Sophia felt the humiliation like a slap. She wasn't a troublemaker, she was a model student. The veiled prohibition wasn't to protect her, but to isolate her, to reassert the invisible barriers that separated their worlds. When Elena found out, the injustice burned in her chest. It was the same humiliation she had felt her entire life, the sense of constantly being put in her proper place. The urge to fade away, to flee, returned with force. But then she remembered the weight of Arthur's jacket on her shoulders, the promise that no one is left alone here. She took a deep breath and made a decision. She wouldn't complain to the dean. She wouldn't confront anyone. She would fight with the weapons she had, resilience and dignity. It was in this climate of growing oppression that a small but significant victory occurred. During one of the physical therapy sessions, Leo was disheartened. The exercises seemed pointless, the mockery of his classmates echoing in his mind. Elena, who had once cared for elderly patients with mobility issues at a public health clinic, had an idea. She had kept a pair of trekking poles from a former patient. The next day, she brought them to Arthur's house. "Let's forget therapy for one day," she told Leo. "Let's learn to dance." She put on an old soul song on her phone. With infinite patience, She taught the boy to use the poles not as support, but as dance partners, tapping out the rhythm on the floor. 1, 2, 1, 2. Feel the beat, Leo. The boy, reluctant at first, began to loosen up. The movement became less of an effort and more of an expression. The next day, arriving at school, Elena encouraged him, "Show them your new dance step." Leo hesitated, fear visible in his eyes. But then he looked at Elena, saw the unwavering confidence she placed in him, and something solidified within him. With the poles in hand, he started to cross the courtyard, not limping but moving in a rhythm of his own, an almost musical cadence. His head, once always down, was held high. Students stopped to watch. There was no mockery, only surprise. And then, from a corner, one student started clapping to the rhythm of the poles. Another joined in, and then another. In seconds, the entire courtyard was applauding Leo's courageous crossing. The leader of the bullies, however, watched from afar, his face contorted in a scowl of pure resentment. The admiration Leo was receiving was an insult to his own popularity, and he was already starting to plan a new, more cruel public humiliation. Leo's small victory in the school courtyard was like a breath of fresh air in the suffocating atmosphere. For the first time, he wasn't the target of pity or mockery, but of admiration. The change in his posture was visible. He seemed taller, more confident, as if the applause had strengthened his spine. Arthur, upon hearing about it from an emotional Eleanor, felt a wave of fatherly pride that surprised him. He was used to celebrating profits and acquisitions, but the joy of seeing his son conquer a few yards of a courtyard with dignity was a form of return on investment that none of his financial portfolios could ever match. That victory, however, would be short-lived. The universe seemed to be conspiring to test the boy's resilience. The second blow came in the form of a notification on Leo's phone. It was a message from his former soccer coach, a man he idolized, whose opinion was gold. The text was short, direct, and devastating. "Heard you're causing drama at school, kid. If you'd had more grit on the field, none of this would have happened. Injuries are part of the game, but quitting is for the weak." Every word was a punch. The message reopened the wound of guilt that Leo had been secretly carrying. He blamed himself for the accident, for the leg that didn't respond as it should have, for the lack of grit that the coach now confirmed. The progress he had worked so hard to achieve unraveled in an instant. He locked himself in his room, pushed the crutches into a corner, and announced he would not go back to physical therapy. Apathy returned, thicker and heavier than before. Arthur felt powerless. He tried to reason with the logic of a CEO, talking about discipline and long-term goals, but his words couldn't reach his son, who retreated further and further into his shell of despair. It was Elena who, once again, found the way. With the experience forged in the corridors of the public health system, where a lack of resources had taught her to value every small step forward, she proposed a new plan to Arthur. "Forget rehab for now," she said, her voice gentle. "Let's focus on micro goals, achieving small things every day." The plan was simple and brilliantly human. The first goal: climb 2 flights of stairs a day, inside the house. The reward wouldn't be an expensive gift that would humiliate him, but something they could share. A Chicago-style hot dog bought at a street fair, an old black-and-white movie watched together in the living room, or a trip to the lakefront overlook to watch the sunset over the city. Things that didn't cost much money but offered a cash flow of affection and presence. Arthur, desperate for a solution, agreed immediately. He saw the wisdom in Elena's approach, a wisdom that didn't come from management books, but from real life. Meanwhile, Arthur's meeting with Victoria Vance and the other board members of the investment fund was approaching. The pressure from his partner, Richard, mounted daily. In a tense phone call, Richard delivered his ultimatum. "Arthur, I admire your loyalty to this woman. I really do. But if you continue this public exposure, if this turns into a scandal, I will be forced to protect the firm's interests. We have a major community outreach program, one that benefits hundreds of children. I will not hesitate to cut the funding for that project if I feel your stubbornness is putting our assets at risk." The threat was the lowest possible blow. Richard was using the company's philanthropy, a project Arthur cared deeply about, as a weapon of blackmail, turning his life's work into a potential tool of oppression. Arthur hung up the phone, the weight of the decision crushing his shoulders. Protecting his son and Elena would mean sacrificing the well-being of many other children. The choice seemed impossible. Richard's ultimatum echoed in Arthur's mind, a cruel dissonance between his personal life and his corporate responsibilities. He had built his empire on the premise that rational, emotionless decisions yielded the best results. Now, that philosophy was crumbling. Every choice felt like an emotional liability, an inevitable loss. Cutting funding for the community project would be a betrayal of his own principles. But exposing the company to a scandal could lead to the collapse of everything he had built. He felt trapped, a billionaire whose options seemed as limited as a panicking small-time investors. In the midst of this tension, a bright spot emerged from where it was least expected. The school's cultural fair, once a bureaucratic obstacle, became an unexpected refuge. Sophia, with her literary sensibility, had an idea. "What if we put on a poetry slam?" she proposed to Leo, who was spending his days submerged in an apathetic silence. A slam about words, the ones that hurt and the ones that heal. The idea of public speaking terrified Leo, but Sophia's passion was contagious. She convinced him that he wouldn't have to give a speech, just read a short poem, something that came from within. Together, they began selecting texts, rehearsing their intonation, and transforming pain into art. They would call the project Words That Don't Wound. When Arthur heard about the poetry slam, he saw an opportunity. They needed a quiet place to rehearse, away from the prying eyes at school. With a logistical excuse, he offered his company's event hall. "It's closer for everyone, better acoustics," he justified, hiding his true motive: to create a sanctuary for the children, a space where they could feel safe and valued. Deep down, it was his way of saying, "I'm with you," an investment of emotional capital he hoped would yield dividends of trust. It was in that event hall, a place normally reserved for business cocktails and financial reports, that the chemistry between Arthur and Eleanor began to pulse undeniably. While the children rehearsed on the makeshift stage, the two adults managed things backstage. As he adjusted a microphone for Sophia, their hands brushed for an instant. The contact was brief, electric, and they both pulled back as if they had touched something both dangerous and precious. Later, when Leo, overcoming his shyness, recited a short, heartfelt poem about walking at his own pace, their eyes met from across the hall. In that shared glance, there was pride, complicity, and something deeper, a mutual admiration that transcended the employer-employee relationship. They resisted this feeling with all their might. Arthur, the strategist, feared that turning gratitude into romance could destroy the fragile alliance they had built, further complicating his son's situation. He saw the risk of mixing emotional assets with an already volatile situation. Elena, for her part, was afraid of being misinterpreted. The social chasm between them was a constant reminder of how the world would see her. The humble caregiver who seduced the wealthy boss, she protected herself with a professional distance, a shield against the vulnerability she felt growing every time he looked at her that way. The storm, however, was already gathering on the horizon, ready to destroy their fragile refuge. Victoria Vance, feeling she was losing control of the narrative, decided to escalate the conflict. She would no longer use parents' group chats. She hired a lawyer and, in a move calculated to cause maximum damage, filed a formal complaint against Elena for intimidation and harassment of minor students. The official notice arrived via a process server late one afternoon. a cold and impersonal document that turned an act of protection into a crime. Elena felt the floor disappear from under her feet. The war was no longer an exchange of barbs, but a legal battlefield. And she was the only one unarmed. The legal notice was a brutal blow. The technical jargon and cold language of the document turned Eleanor's reality into a bureaucratic nightmare. Intimidation, harassment, terms that painted her as an aggressor, a criminal. The accusation was so absurd, so far from the truth, that for a moment she felt dizzy, as if the world had turned upside down. The fear she felt wasn't just of the looming legal battle, for which she had neither the emotional nor the financial resources. It was a deeper fear of having her dignity publicly destroyed, of being labeled and forever marked by a lie. Her most primitive instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, before the humiliation consumed her completely. The news landed like a bomb in the already tense school environment. Mrs. Albright, whose primary motivation was to protect Northwood Prep's flawless reputation, panicked. A formal complaint involving an employee, even an indirect one, and students was a stain she could not tolerate. Without even hearing Eleanor's side, acting with the swiftness of someone trying to contain a toxic spill, she made a drastic decision. The Words That Don't Wound Poetry Slam was suspended. To avoid further controversy and to protect the emotional integrity of the students involved, she justified in a vague statement, a masterpiece of corporate speak that said everything by saying nothing. The suspension of the poetry slam was more than the cancellation of an event. It was the nullification of Leo and Sophia's efforts, a clear sign that their voices didn't matter in the face of power and influence. At the same time, Richard, Arthur's partner, saw the crisis as the perfect opportunity to execute his plan. With news of the formal complaint spreading, the negative brand exposure he so feared had become a concrete reality. He acted with the speed of a predator. He called an emergency board meeting, presenting the situation as proof of Arthur's reckless and emotionally compromised management. He is mixing his personal problems with our business, endangering the wealth we have all built. A company's reputation is its greatest asset, and his is contaminated, he argued. With charts and projections showing a potential drop in stock value, his goal was clear: to use the crisis to oust Arthur from the presidency and assume total control. For Elena, each piece of news was another nail in her coffin. She saw the circle tightening, not just around her, but around everyone she wanted to protect. Arthur was about to lose his company because of her. Leo and Sophia were losing a project that had given them hope. The guilt gnawed at her. That night, with a heart heavy, with a pain that felt unbearable, she made the only decision that seemed honorable. She wrote a simple letter to Arthur, resigning. "I cannot allow my presence to cause any more harm to you and your family," she wrote, tears staining the cheap paper. "I appreciate your trust, but I must step away." The letter, delivered by Sophia the next morning, was the final blow for Arthur. He was in his office, the glass-walled house feeling like a luxury prison, when he read Elena's words. Her resignation, combined with his partner's betrayal and the school's cowardice, created an overwhelming sense of defeat. Leo, upon learning of Elena's decision and the cancellation of the slam, lowered his head again. The small flame of confidence that had been lit within him was completely extinguished. The silence that fell over the house was thick, a fog of despair. Everything seemed lost. The money, the influence, the power, nothing seemed enough to turn the tide. Arthur looked out the window at the lights of Chicago and felt like the poorest man in the world. The fog of defeat hanging over Arthur's house was almost palpable. Elena's resignation letter lay on his desk, a silent testament to his powerlessness. He, the man who moved fortunes with a phone call, who saw the world as a set of variables to be controlled, was paralyzed. Every path before him seemed to lead to a cliff. Giving in to Richard meant betraying himself. Fighting for Elena seemed like a lost cause that would drag everyone down. For the first time in his adult life, Arthur didn't have a plan, a strategy. He was simply lost. It was then that the unexpected happened. An email arrived in his inbox with a simple subject line regarding the incident in the hallway. The sender was a group of teachers from Northwood Prep. With a hesitation that had become habitual, Arthur opened the message. What he read made him sit up straight. It was a letter, a joint, detailed account of what had happened that afternoon. The teachers, who had witnessed the scene but remained silent out of fear or inertia, had decided they could no longer stay quiet. Victoria Vance's formal complaint and the suspension of the poetry slam had been the last straw. The document clearly described the bullying Leo had endured, the cruel words, the sneering laughter. But it went further. It praised Elena's actions, describing her not as intimidating, but as firm, careful, and exemplarily protective. The letter was a passionate defense of the truth, signed by 7 educators who had decided to risk their jobs in the name of decency. That email wasn't just evidence. It was a shot of adrenaline to Arthur's heart. The courage of those teachers rekindled his own. The fog dissipated, and the strategist's mind began to work again, now fueled not just by logic, but by a righteous fury. He printed the letter. The paper in his hands felt as heavy as a gold bar. It was his moral capital, his most valuable asset at that moment. He didn't call his lawyers, he didn't call Richard. He marched in person to the school. He walked into Miss Albright's office unannounced, his imposing presence making the dean shrink in her chair. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed the letter on her desk. "Read it," he said. As she read, her face losing its color, he dictated his terms, not as an angry father, but as a chairman of the board setting new policy. The poetry slam will be reinstated. The restorative circles will begin next week with an external mediator whom I will pay for. And the school will implement an anti-harassment protocol with training for all staff. Either that, or this letter becomes a public document. Threatening the school's reputation was the only language Ms. Albright understood. She capitulated. But Arthur wasn't finished. He established a fundamental rule, a principle that would guide the entire process. "No witch hunt," he said, his voice resonating with unquestionable authority. "I don't want the boys expelled. I want accountability and repair. I want them to learn something from this." The demand was so unexpected, so contrary to the thirst for revenge one might expect, that the dean looked at him with a new understanding. She wasn't just dealing with a rich, powerful father, but with a man of principle. In that moment, the balance of power had definitively shifted. Arthur was no longer reacting to the crisis. He was leading it, transforming the mud of injustice into the foundation for real change. The restorative circles took place in the school gymnasium, a vast, impersonal space that seemed to amplify the tension. The cold light from the fluorescent lamps reflected off the polished resin floor, and the smell of rubber and sweat hung in the air. Chairs were arranged in a large circle, an attempt to create an environment of equality, but the emotional distance between the families seemed insurmountable. On one side, Arthur, Leo, and Elena, who had agreed to participate after Arthur's insistence, felt like a fragile, united front. On the other, Victoria Vance, her husband and their son, the ringleader, exuded a defensive hostility. Ms. Albright and the external mediator completed the circle, trying to maintain an appearance of neutrality. The mediator, a woman with a calm voice and an attentive gaze, began the process. She explained that the goal was not to assign blame, but to understand the impact of the actions and find a path toward repair. The initial statements were filled with accusations and justifications. Victoria defended her son fiercely, downplaying the incident as boys being boys, while her husband spoke in legal terms about the undue pressure his son was under. The ringleader himself kept his head down, a mixture of arrogance and fear in his posture. The turning point came when the mediator gave Leo the floor. In a trembling but clear voice, he didn't describe the bullying in terms of anger or revenge. He spoke about the fear of walking through the hallways, the sound of laughter echoing in his head at night, the shame that made him want to be invisible. He didn't accuse, he simply shared his pain. The boy's simple, honest account had a power that no adult argument had managed to achieve. The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, the ringleader looked up. Faced with Leo's real pain, his tough guy facade began to crumble. Pressed by the mediator, he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "I was just repeating jokes I saw in videos online. I thought it was funny." The banal, almost pathetic confession exposed the emptiness behind the cruelty. Victoria Vance, who had maintained a hard expression until then, faltered. Seeing her son's vulnerability, his admission that he was just an imitator of digital cruelty seemed to break something inside her. Her hardened posture gave way to an expression of bewilderment and perhaps shame. The process was long and painful, but in the end, an agreement was reached. The complaint against Elena would be withdrawn. The boys involved would have to complete community service, including a project on the effects of bullying, and most importantly, the school committed to adopting the inclusion protocol Arthur had proposed, with the training provided and funded by him. The victory, however, came at a high price. The next day, Richard made good on his threat. He not only dissolved their partnership, but used his influence to convince two major clients to pull their investments from Arthur's firm. The news of the financial hit reached Arthur by email, a cold, calculated blow. He looked at the red numbers on the screen, at the capital draining away, and to his own surprise, he felt a strange sense of relief. He had chosen to lose a multi-million-dollar contract to win his son's peace of mind, and in that moment, the trade felt like the best deal he had ever made in his life. With the dust from the legal battle settling, a new dynamic began to take hold. Elena agreed to return to work at Arthur's house, but not without setting her own terms. She found him in the kitchen as he was unsuccessfully trying to make coffee. With the straight posture and firm voice he had come to admire, she laid out the new rules. "Mr. Crestwood, Arthur, I'll come back, but things have to be different. No more secrets, no more favors. I'm not a charity case, and I don't want to be treated like a liability to be managed. We are partners in this, or we are nothing." Her words, direct and unvarnished, struck him with the force of truth. He had tried to protect her with his money and influence, but in doing so had inadvertently diminished her. He had seen her as someone to be saved, when in fact she was the strongest person he knew. Arthur turned off the coffee machine, faced her, and nodded. "You are absolutely right, Elena. Partners." He wanted to offer her a reward, something to show the depth of his gratitude, but he knew any offer of money would be an insult, a repeat of the mistake he had just made. Her value couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. He needed something that would add to her, not buy her. And then the idea came, as clear and precise as a good investment strategy. He called Leo and Sophia into the living room, in front of the two children who had become the center of this small universe. He made his proposal. "Elena, the courage you've shown is a rare asset. And what you did for Leo, the method you used, can help many other families." He proposed the creation of a mentorship program for parents of children in rehabilitation, a space to share experiences and strategies, combining emotional support with practical goals. "And I can't think of anyone better to co-lead this project with me than you, not as my employee, but as my partner." Before Eleanor could process the shock of the proposal, he turned to Sophia. "And so that your mother can dedicate herself to this with peace of mind, I want to ensure that nothing gets in the way of your education. He then revealed that he had established, with his personal funds and in the name of an anonymous foundation, a full scholarship for her to pursue her degree in English literature, her lifelong dream at any university she chose. It wasn't a gift, it was an investment in the bright future he saw in her. The gesture, made there, in front of their children, with no hint of romance, but with the respect of a business agreement, left Elena trembling. The tears that welled in her eyes were not of servile gratitude, but of profound recognition. He wasn't trying to buy her or control her. He was investing in her intelligence, in her strength. He was offering her a seat at the table, not as a guest, but as an equal. Her heart, which had been on guard for so long, finally surrendered. In that moment, in that sunlit room, she admitted to herself in a silent whisper that her heart already belonged to this complicated, controlling, and surprisingly just man. She looked at Arthur, who was watching her with a vulnerability that belied his fortune, and knew that the most valuable inheritance they could build together would not be measured in assets, but in bonds of trust and respect. The cultural fair, once a stage for tension and uncertainty, finally took place. The gym, now stripped of the cold formality of the restorative circles, was vibrant, filled with parents, students, and the smell of sweet popcorn. The Words That Don't Wound Poetry Slam was the closing event, the most anticipated moment. When Leo was called to the stage, a respectful silence fell over the place. He walked to the microphone, his trekking poles marking a steady rhythm on the wooden floor, a beat that was all his own. He didn't look nervous, he looked focused, like an athlete before a major game. Arthur watched from the front row, his heart pounding against his ribs. He, who was used to addressing hundreds of investors, felt a nervousness he had never known. It was the fear and pride of a father, a pure emotion, unfiltered by capital or strategy. Elena stood in the wings, next to Sophia, her hands clutching the simple necklace she had inherited from her mother. A small token of strength. Her eyes were fixed on Leo, and when he glanced her way for a brief second, she whispered, more to herself than to him, "Go." Leo took a deep breath and, in a clear, firm voice, recited the poem he had written. It was just 4 lines, simple and powerful. My step was fear, my step was pain. Now, my step is mine and has its claim. The entire gym remained silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. And then, the applause erupted. Not polite applause, but a genuine, warm ovation that enveloped the boy in a wave of acceptance. At the back of the gym, the former bullies, now committed to their restorative tasks, were helping with the event's accessibility, guiding wheelchair users and the elderly. Their faces showed no resentment, but a serious concentration, as if they finally understood the weight of their new responsibilities. Arthur felt his eyes well up, a display of emotion he rarely allowed himself in public. He didn't care. That moment was worth more than his entire net worth. After the applause, as the crowd began to disperse, the 4 of them, Arthur, Elena, Leo, and Sophia, met outside. The night air was cool, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. To celebrate, Arthur had bought a small cake and a bag of pastries from a food stall. They sat on the bumper of his car in the parking lot and had an impromptu celebration. The day's goal, climbing 3 flights of stairs, had been met. As they lit a small candle on the cake, a gust of wind blew it out. They all laughed, an easy, spontaneous laugh that sealed the bond between them. In that moment, they weren't the millionaire, the caregiver, the boy in rehab, and the studious girl. They were just a family, united by shared battles and small victories celebrated with pastries. The romance, so carefully postponed and contained, found its voice in the purity of that instant. Leo, with the naturalness that only courage and innocence can provide, looked at Arthur's and Elena's hands, which were close but not touching on the car's hood. He gently pushed his father's hand until it covered Elena's. "You guys go together," he said with a knowing smile. The simple gesture broke the final barrier. Arthur looked at Elena, and in her eyes he no longer saw fear or hesitation. He saw an invitation. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that wasn't a spectacle, but a quiet promise, sealed by the distant sound of Leo's poles tapping on the ground, like the soft beat of a heart, announcing that the parade of their life was just beginning. The kiss in the parking lot wasn't an ending, but the start of a new chapter. Written in a language of normalcy and routine, the resolution of their conflicts didn't magically erase the difficulties, but it established clear and consistent rules for facing them. Revenge was replaced by repair, improvisation by presence, and appearances by authenticity. The sideways glances from some mothers in the school hallways still existed. The bureaucracy of implementing the new anti-harassment protocol was slow. And for Leo, there were still days when the pain in his leg was a physical reminder of all he had been through. But now, they didn't face any of it alone. The mentorship program envisioned by Arthur and co-led by Elena began to take shape. They rented a small commercial space, far from the luxury of Arthur's firm, a neutral and welcoming place. The news spread organically from parent to parent. Soon, a small group of families began to meet weekly. Elena, with her empathy and practical experience, guided the conversations, while Arthur, with his strategic mind, helped parents create micro-goal plans, adapting the logic of investments to emotional recovery. He spoke of compounding interest of trust and return on affection, translating his financial world into the language of care. The project grew, fueled not by large capital injections, but by the investment of time and humanity. At the school, the changes were gradual but noticeable. The discussion circles became part of the academic calendar, and the inclusion training, initially met with skepticism by some teachers, began to shift the culture of the place. Ms. Albright, once concerned only with the institution's image, became a cautious but genuine advocate for the new protocol. She realized that a school's true reputation lay not in its facade of perfection, but in its ability to handle imperfections in a human and constructive way. The split with Richard left financial scars. Arthur's company lost important contracts, and he was forced to restructure his business, selling off some assets and streamlining operations. But to his surprise, the crisis revealed who his true partners were. Investors who valued integrity and long-term vision remained, and the company, though smaller, became more solid in its values. Richard's departure wasn't the end, but a purification that gave the company a new, more resilient identity. At home, the dynamic among the four deepened. Evenings were filled with simple dinners, help with homework, and old movie nights. Arthur learned to cook, or at least to try, and his clumsy attempts became a source of laughter. Elena, in turn, began to feel truly at home, not as an employee, but as the emotional pillar of this newly formed family. Sophia's scholarship was approved, and she prepared for college with a sparkle in her eye, knowing her future wasn't a gift, but an achievement her mother, with her quiet courage, had helped build. Arthur and Elena's relationship blossomed away from the spotlight in small gestures, a cup of coffee brought to a desk, a hand reaching for another during a movie, a look of complicity exchanged over the children's heads. It was a partnership built not on overwhelming passion, but on the firm foundation of mutual respect and admiration. They had found in each other not a missing half, but the partner with whom it was worth building a life's portfolio, whose dividends were paid in peace and happiness. Time, which once seemed an enemy, became an ally, weaving the loose threads of their lives into a cohesive and colorful tapestry. A year after the cultural fair, the backyard of the glass-walled house in the suburbs hosted a different kind of celebration. It wasn't a business party with expensive champagne and talk of the stock market. but a Sunday barbecue, with the smell of damp grass and the sound of laughter echoing through the air. The guests were the families from the mentorship project, the teachers who had signed the letter, and a few friends who had stood by Arthur after the storm. It was a gathering of the true assets of their lives. Leo, now without his crutches, moved with a newfound lightness. He still had a slight limp, a subtle reminder of his journey, but he carried it not with shame, but with the ease of someone who has accepted their own scars. He was organizing a pickup soccer game with the other children, shouting and laughing, belonging. Sophia, home from college for the holiday, was reading a poem to a small group on the porch. Her voice confident and passionate, the future teacher already inspiring her first audience. Arthur was at the grill, his apron smudged with charcoal, an unthinkable image for the multimillionaire of a year ago. He looked up and met Elena's gaze from across the yard. She was talking to a new mother from the mentorship group, her hand on the woman's shoulder conveying silent comfort. In that exchanged look, there was a universe of understanding. They had built something solid, something real that went far beyond the cash flow of their businesses or the balance of their bank accounts. They had turned pain into purpose and gratitude into love. Later, as night fell and the guests began to leave, the four of them were left alone in the yard. The lights of Chicago twinkled in the background, a sea of urban stars. Soft music played in the distance. Arthur held out his hand to Eleanor. "Dance with me," he asked, his voice low. She accepted, and they began to dance slowly on the grass, a simple, unchoreographed rhythm. Leo, watching from the porch, picked up his old trekking poles, which he kept as a trophy, and began to tap them on the floor, creating a soft, rhythmic percussion for his parents' dance. "My step is my own," he whispered to Sophia, who smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. Arthur and Elena's dance was a metaphor for their journey, a bit clumsy, but perfectly synchronized in its intention. He didn't lead with force, and she didn't follow passively. They moved together, supporting each other in a balance of giving and receiving. The romantic justice that had seemed so unlikely had arrived, not as a fairy tale climax, but as the serene peace of a Sunday evening. The greatest wealth Arthur had ever accumulated wasn't stored in gold or cryptocurrency, but right there, in the arms of the woman who taught him the value of courage, under the gaze of the children who taught him the meaning of presence. Because sometimes life shows us that the greatest investment we can make is in the dignity of another, and the return is always an inheritance of incalculable love.